was an author that we had an event with, and at that time we could only do it via Zoom. And she and Stanley are both in, what's it?
It's a book group. We review each other's work and critique each other's work.
And is it only mystery writers, or?
No.
No, okay, yeah. So that was a connection that was made with her, and we're happy to have him here tonight. And I'm going to let him tell you about his history and where you come from and what motivated your writing, and then at the end we'll have some questions for you. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you and welcome.
This is just wonderful. But, I love coming to libraries anywhere, but this is very special. It's you're very lucky. But I'm sure that you also support it a lot, which is of course very important. So my writing partner, Michael Sears, apologizes. He could not be here today. He was meant to be here, but about 6 weeks ago in the south coast of South Africa, which is where he lives, he had a mini stroke and woke up one morning with double vision, and that's all gone. He's fine again, but his doctor doesn't think that sitting on an aeroplane for 22 hours is a smart thing, of course, with blood clot potentials and so on. So he does apologize. He wishes he could be here, and next time he will be. So where to start? I'm also originally South African. I was born and raised in Johannesburg and came to this country as to do a master's degree at the University of Illinois in 1971. And I had borrowed enough money to do just a one-year stint. It was very expensive for out-of-state people to do that. And I was just very lucky indeed that during the first semester of that year, my advisor asked me a very interesting question. And he said, "You are a pilot, are you not?" And I was a private pilot, barely. I had just got about 50 or 60 hours at the time. And my interest at the university was the use of computers in education. And he said, the aviation research lab at the university, which was probably the #1 aviation research lab in the country, wants somebody to explore how computers can help pilot training. I was probably the only person on the planet who both had a pilot's license and was interested in computers and education. So I got an assistantship that then paid for my tuition and a small stipend, and I eventually ended up with a doctorate in educational psychology, and a sort of a mix between computer science and education. It was the pilot part that was more interesting to me. And every year I would go back. I came to the University of Minnesota in 1983. And every year I would go back to South Africa during the summer. I didn't like teaching in the summer, see my family and see my friends. And one of the things that I used to do was to rent a small plane, get my friends, and we would go on flying safaris to Zimbabwe in the north and Botswana to the west. Most people around in the Midwest don't know much about Botswana. It's a very big country. It's bigger than France by about 5%. France has 65 million people. Botswana has 2. So there are vast areas in the country that are totally unpopulated. And most of the country is desert, the Kalahari Desert. Somewhere in the 1980s, and I don't remember exactly when, I was on one of those flying trips in the Chobe National Park in Botswana, huge national park. And we watched a pack of hyenas hunt and kill a wildebeest. Wildebeest is a very big antelope, and hyenas are ferocious hunters when they can't scavenge. And 3 or 4 hours later, the wildebeest had disappeared. the hyenas eat both the flesh and the bones. So there's nothing left. And Michael and I that evening, probably after a glass of wine or two, said, if we ever have to get rid of a body, this is an obvious thing to do. No body, no case. And both of us were very keen readers of murder mysteries. And we said, you know, we should try writing one of these things. You know, we read enough of them. Maybe we can write one. Anyway, you know, he's also an academic. He was a professor of mathematics. And you know how fast people in academia move. So we started writing 15 years later, in 2003. And we'd never written fiction before other than some schoolboy stuff. And we didn't really know what we were doing, so it took 3 years to end up with a manuscript. We gave it to our friends, who of course obediently said it was wonderful. We didn't believe them, but we handed it out to some people who were good readers, and they said, you should really try to get this published. We couldn't find a publisher or an agent in South Africa, and I was working in Minneapolis at the time, and through a long story that I won't bore you with, we managed to get an agent in New York who was actually originally from Minneapolis. And about 3 weeks later, I was working at my desk at home when the phone rang, and she said, I've got some good news for you. HarperCollins wants to buy the book. HarperCollins. And she gave a number, and I fell off the chair. and she misunderstood my falling off the chair and my silence. She said, no, don't worry, I'm going to get them to offer you more money. We would have paid them, of course. Anyway, a week later she came back. She had in fact increased the amount, and they wanted a 2-book contract. She said, you are doing a 2-book contract, aren't you? We said, of course. And she said, well, they'd like a synopsis of the 2nd book next week. So we were very desperately over the internet and chatting and all of this. We handed in a synopsis of book 2 the following week. And it's interesting that of all the books we've written, that synopsis is the closest to the final product than any of them. And guess how that book starts? It starts with a hyena and a game ranger and a professor of ecology from the University of Botswana stumble across this hyena that's eating a corpse. And it didn't take them very long to realize that this was no accident. The corpse had no clothes, the teeth had been knocked out. So clearly it was an attempt to do what we had said 15 years earlier, get rid of the body so there would be no evidence of it. Because we were both professors and we were told that we should write what we know, the professor of ecology was going to be the main character. And of course, when you find a body that clearly is a murder victim, you have to call the police. So we sent a detective from the capital of the country, Gaborone it's called, out into the middle of the Kalahari National Park to investigate. And we just had fun with him, driving along, singing. He's a terrible singer, so the only time he can sing is in the car. And so on. By the time he got to the scene of the crime, he had taken over as the main character. We never had any intention of having a police procedural. It was going to be our professor. But Kubu, as he is now known by, his real name is David Bengu. And when he was a kid, he still is, he's a big man. And one of his school kid friends gave him the nickname Kubu, which in the local language means hippopotamus. As an aside, hippos are the third most dangerous animal in Africa. Number one, what do you think?
Lion.
No,
Mamba.
no,
Rhino.
no,
Hippopotamus.
no. The mosquito
Oh my.
kills more people than anybody else. Number two, humans. And number three, hippos. So it's a good metaphor, really. He's a big guy. He's generally fairly placid, but you don't actually want to get in his way when he's roused. So Kubu, as everybody calls him, is our main character. And as I said, the first book, which was called A Carrion Death, you can see it on the left there, is the first of 6 books in a series. When we finished book 6, we said, we've written these 6 books, but we don't know a lot about Kubu. I mean, we know about him as an accomplished detective in the Botswana Police Service. We know that we've had 6 books where he's been married and has kids and so on, but we don't know anything about him as a young man. So we went back and wrote a prequel, which is called Facets of Death, which is on the right down there. And that starts with his first day on the job. It opens with him standing in front of the Criminal Investigation Department, and he walks in on his first job. He's just come out of university, it's his first job, and so on. And we really enjoyed that, and he immediately gets plunged into all sorts of issues. He's not popular within the CID because he's gone straight from university to being a detective sergeant, whereas all the other detective sergeants probably had to spend 10 years on the beat, marching around, etc., being a policeman. So they really resented the fact that he got straight in without having to do that. So part of the issue that he has to deal with is that. He has to deal with colleagues who are not helpful, who are obstructionist, and so on. Botswana is the home of the 2 richest diamond mines in the world. This is true. One is called Zhwaneng, and the other one is called Orapa. And the main story of Facets of Death, you can see there's a diamond connection, is about a heist of diamonds. Zhwaneng mines 100,000 carats a day. And every day they have to transport that from the Zhwaneng mine to a central facility in Gaborone. Normally it's flown, it's much safer, much quicker, but on the day that the story really starts, there is a fire on the plane that's meant to take it. So they put into place a second way of doing it, which had been carefully thought out and would make it extremely difficult for anybody to hijack it. But of course, on the way to Gaborone, there are multiple vehicles. The correct vehicle is hijacked, the one with the diamonds. So that's a huge issue because Botswana relies on the diamond revenue for a lot of its general revenue. So something like that affects everybody. So Kubu gets involved in that, and it gets complicated very quickly because the people who hijacked the vehicle are very soon found themselves to be killed. So that becomes a greater puzzle. Then we thought, well, that was interesting. We found something about Kubu. He's a very shy person personally. If he's talking about something he knows, he can talk to anybody, but his feelings of romantic feelings are very difficult for him. He's never had a girlfriend. He doesn't think he ever will because of his size. And he meets a young woman in the records department of the police service and immediately gets a crush on her. And he has no idea how to handle crush. He has no idea how to speak to her. And so that's a little subplot that's sort of running in the background. And then the book that we've just released this month, called A Deadly Covenant, is the second prequel. It occurs a few months after the Facets of Death ends. And it's very different because the book starts with a backhoe operator digging a trench for a water pipe up in the northwest of Botswana to take water from the Kavango River to try and irrigate some more land in this very sort of desert-like area. And he's operating the backhoe, and he looks in the bucket at one stage, and there's a skull in the bucket. Now, this is not an educated person, so he doesn't know whether it's a human skull or a skull of a baboon, because there are plenty of baboons in the area too. But he sort of feels that he has some obligation to check it out. He doesn't really want to stop because he's paid by the hour. He's not salaried. And so he goes over and looks in the trench, and there are more bones. So he's forced to call the police, and the police, of course, cordon off the area, and he won't work for a couple of days, so he's not happy. From Gaborone, Kubu and the forensic pathologist come thinking this is just an old cold case. They don't know if it's now they think it's a human because they've faxed through some photos. And the pathologist, a Scotsman called Ian McGregor, eventually finds 9 skeletons. They're all Bushmen, men, women, and kids, and they've all been murdered. Now, a skeleton in the desert could be 200 years old, could be 50 years old. It's very difficult to tell that. You can tell the age the person died, but you can't tell when the person died very easily. So they sort of not sure whether this is a cold case or whether this is something they should call the anthropologists in for rather than the police. And while they're sort of dealing with all of that, one of the senior councillors in the village gets murdered. So now everything starts to change. Police don't believe in coincidences, and probably appropriately so. And not long after that, a woman who has been railing against the water project because she says that the water spirit called Mami Wata, it's a name of the water spirit. Many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, that the water spirit has told her that all hell will break loose if the water project doesn't stop. So she says, you see, I told you this old man's been murdered. And then she's murdered. And so that's the starting part of the story. I'm not going to tell you the whole story. But where it leads is to the Bushmen. And I've been probably 20 times to Botswana, Michael probably the same. We try to visit most of the places, if not all the places we write about. And we've done a huge amount of research. Both of us are academics by training, so research is sort of in our blood. And the group of people within Botswana that interested us most of all were the Bushmen. The Bushmen are not black, they're not white, they're totally different from anything else in the area. Very similar to what are called the Aborigines in Australia. They're more yellow than any other color, and they're very short and have lived in that part of the world for thousands of years. And people who do DNA analyses these days reckon that they are the living group that is the oldest, that most people have some bit of Bushman heritage in their DNA. They've been around forever. So we've become very interested in them, and also because they have been mistreated so badly, probably because they're totally misunderstood, and not much differently from what's happened here and in what's happened in Australia. So the nomadic Bushmen usually moved around in small groups, maybe a dozen or 15, and they lived off the desert, and they knew how to do that. They knew where to find water, and if they found water, they would never finish drinking it because they knew that another group at some stage would need it. So they were very unselfish, and they were very giving. If they found something that was wonderful, they would give it away because they didn't want people to be jealous. I don't know if you've ever seen a movie that was made in South Africa, probably 20 years ago, called The Gods Must Be Crazy. You should watch it.
We have it.
You have it. There you are. You should watch it. It's dated in terms of the interactions of the whites, certainly, but how the Bushmen behave and what their thinking is actually comes through very well in that. And I looked at it again about 2 years ago, and that's how I felt. The Bushmen don't believe in ownership. They believe the earth belongs to everybody. And when black groups came from the north in Africa and white groups came from the south, both of those groups believed in ownership. So they would have cattle, for example, and those cattle had an owner, and they put up fences, which the Bushmen didn't understand. But where a real problem came was with the cattle. Historically, Bushmen would hunt an antelope with a poison, and then the antelope could take 2 or 3 days to die, and they would run after the antelope and then cut it up and use that meat. But suddenly they were coming across cows, cattle, that didn't run away. And they said, wow, we don't have to run so far. And so they would kill the cow, which of course was antithetical to the farmers who didn't like it. So the farmers either killed the Bushmen or enslaved them. And the general attitude towards Bushmen is summed up in this piece of information. It was only in the 1930s, 85 years ago, that the last licenses were issued to hunt Bushmen. So you could go down to the clerk at the office and say, I'd like to, maybe 2 giraffes and a springbok and a couple of Bushmen, please. I mean, it's astonishing. So we've had a very sympathetic view of Bushmen and have incorporated them in many of our books. So there is a Bushman in our first book, A Carrion Death. It's a Bushman who actually was the reason Kubu became a detective. They were schoolboys together. Kubu was fat, and Homonego was short and a Bushman. Both of them were ridiculed by their colleagues. And so they became most unlikely friends. And Homonego once took Kubu out into the desert and drew a circle in the sand and asked Kubu what he saw there. And like probably most of us, he saw sand and he saw maybe a little bit of growth over there, and that's about it. And Homonego couldn't believe how badly Kubu observed what was there and proceeded to show him that there was a whole world of things going on in that big circle of sand. And it so impressed Kubu that he made a pledge to himself that he was going to learn to be observant, and he ended up, because of that, wanting to become a detective, which he did. The third book, called Death of the Mantis, is the backstory is all about Bushmen. And again, here in this one, as I have told you, the Bushmen play a big role. So let me just see what the time is. Okay. I would like to read you one piece and then talk about and show you what is happening with what I've got, which I've had for many, many years, are the entire belongings of a male Bushman hunter. What I will show you is all that he would have while he was in the desert. So, as I said, McGregor, the pathologist, and Kubu went up to see the skeleton had been found, and Kubu didn't think he was going to learn a great deal about it. So while McGregor was dusting off the bones, he was sort of wandering around, and he was really surprised to find there was a big crowd around the crime scene tapes. And so this little scene is Kubu talking to people while McGregor is finding more skeletons. Looking at the scene, Kubu felt a little despondent. He couldn't see an interesting case emerging from a collection of old bones. Nevertheless, he had to do his best. So he wandered into the crowd and started asking whether anyone had any idea of what they were looking at. As expected, most said they'd heard a rumor of a body being found, and curiosity had led them there. "I've never seen a body," a young man said. "I'm so excited," a girl commented. "I've never seen a real skeleton, just pictures of one." Ian pulled what looked like a paintbrush from his briefcase and returned to the backhoe bucket. The crowd pushed forward, eager to see what was going to happen next. It took an angry constable to prevent them breaking through the tape. Get back, he shouted, "or I'll arrest you." That stemmed the tide, at least for the moment. Ian started to carefully sweep away the sand from around the skull. Progress was so painstakingly slow that the crowd started to become restless. They wanted action, not scientific rigor. While this was happening, Kubu continued to talk to people, with much the same results as before. No one knew anything. They were just curious. He turned away and was just about to go back inside the tape when he noticed an elderly woman at the back of the crowd. She was taller than most and had her arms folded so tightly that she looked as though she was hugging herself. Kubu walked over to her. "Dumela, ma." The woman glared at Kubu, then looked back at the trench. "Dumela. Ma, do you know who was buried here? Is that why you're watching?" "I told them Mummy Wata disapproved of their scheme." Kubu didn't respond immediately, as he was trying to understand how the water spirit had anything to do with the skeleton. Eventually he continued, "Ma, I don't understand. How is Mummy Wata involved? They are stealing her water, and now she reveals the past." With that, she turned and walked away. Kubu watched her go, then shook his head, puzzled. As he walked back to Ian, he noticed an old man leaning on a stick, standing away from the crowd, staring intently at what Ian was doing. Kubu joined him. "Dumela ra." The man turned his head. "Dumela." And then he returned to watching Ian. What brings you here, ra?" The man didn't answer for a few moments. "I hope they have found my son." His voice was hardly more than a whisper. "Your son? Is he missing?" The man nodded. Maybe there's a case after all, Kubu thought. "When did you last see him?" The man hesitated again. "On the 5th of September, 1975. Kubu nearly choked, then filled with sadness. This man had been looking for his son for nearly 25 years. Ra, I'm a Detective Sergeant Bengu with the Botswana Police Force. I know it's hard for you, but please tell me what happened. I've told the police many times, but they do nothing. We give them good money and they do nothing. So I will find a report at the Shakawe police station? The man nodded. What is your name, Ra? Dibotello. And the police know where you live? I've lived in the same place for 60 years. Kubu took a deep breath. Ra, I promise I will see what I can find and come and tell you. The man shrugged. Kubu looked to see what Ian was doing. He was in the process of lifting the skull out of the bucket. A murmur ran through the crowd. Ian looked at it from all angles, then put it down and took more photos. Then he pulled some sheets of paper from his briefcase. From where Kubu stood, it looked as though they were filled with photographs. Ian held each sheet next to the skull, comparing what he saw. Eventually, he put the papers back in the briefcase and turned to the crowd. He held up his hand. The crowd went silent. The skull is of a bushman. The crowd buzzed and started dispersing. A bushman's body wasn't of any interest. Kubu noticed the woman who'd been talking about the water spirit. She didn't look disappointed. She looked pleased. Then he glanced at Dibotello. The old man was shuffling slowly away, shoulders hunched and head down. So that sort of sets the stage for what is happening. So what I would like to do is to show you the different parts of this and then open it up for any questions. And if you have a question while I'm showing it, please just ask. So this is the backpack. And unfortunately, the person I bought it from many, many years ago must have put this on the back of his pickup, and there must have been some diesel or something lying in that. And it is weakening the leather. This is probably from an animal called a springbok. And as you can see, it's got the normal little backpack things, and it's got bits and pieces. Here's the thing to put the tip of the spear and so on. And all of this would fit in here. He may hold the bow, probably, but everything basically, this is the life possessions. So first of all, the bow. Now, you can see this is a very flimsy bow. And there's no way that an arrow shot from this bow could kill an antelope, any antelope, particularly if it were an eland, which weighs 2,000 pounds. So they had to figure out how to kill the animal without the arrow being the thing that kills them. So of course they figured out poison. And I'll just briefly talk about one poison, which is very, very interesting. Hand this around, but please be very careful. There is a beetle in Botswana, and the larva from the beetle buries itself about 3 feet under the sand. And when a bushman finds this larva, how they ever found it originally, I have no idea. But if you take those larvae and put it in a little container like this, this is pointed so it sits in the sand, and you mash that up, that poison is lethal. We think of mutual destruction being